If you love me, then prove it. Give me the last thing you have left." Her voice was trembling but steady. Her hands, knotted with age, clutched a faded handkerchief as if it were a shield. Across from her, Gerald didn't flinch. His eyes, once bright with ambition, now burned with impatience. "I'm not asking for much, Mom," he said, louder than necessary. "It's not like you'll need it where you're going." Silence dropped like a heavy curtain. Even the rain tapping against the windows seemed to pause. I stood just behind the doorway, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too loud. My phone was recording, though I wasn't sure if that made me brave or just cowardly. Eleanor Grace. My grandmother looked smaller than ever, hunched in the corner of our worn living room, wrapped in a sweater she'd probably had for 30 years. But her eyes still held something fierce, something sad, something that felt like finality. She didn't speak right away. Her gaze shifted from my father to the window, where the rain traced long, crooked lines down the glass. Then her voice came, quiet but cutting. "I've already given everything. The house, the insurance. All I have now is my savings, just enough for when I need help. Or, if I get sick, you think we won't take care of you?" Gerald stepped forward, voice rising, face flushing red. "You live in our house, you eat our food, and now you're hoarding cash like we're strangers." The room felt colder, the air heavier. I could see my mom Diane leaning against the hallway wall, arms crossed, her face unreadable. "I'm not hoarding anything," Eleanor whispered. "I'm just trying to hold on to something that's still mine." And that's when my father snapped. He lunged forward, yanked the handkerchief from her lap, and tossed it to the floor. Her breath hitched. My own fists clenched involuntarily. "If you won't share what you have, then don't stay here," he hissed. "We don't need dead weight." Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood up slowly, painfully, and walked to her room. I could hear the quiet drag of her suitcase across the hardwood floor, the clink of the zipper, the soft shuffle of shoes on tile. Then, the front door creaked open. Rain rushed in, soaking the silence. I ran to the window, phone still in hand. She was out there, alone, under a broken umbrella, her suitcase sitting beside her like a worn-out secret. Her figure blurred behind sheets of rain. But even in that storm, she didn't look back. I don't know what finally snapped in me. Maybe it was guilt, maybe shame, or maybe it was the image of the only person who ever showed me kindness being pushed out of the only place that should have felt like home. I grabbed my coat, heart racing, legs moving on instinct, and burst out the door into the night. The cold rain hit me like a slap to the face, but I couldn't feel anything. I just knew I couldn't let her walk away like that. Not again. Most mornings in Portland began the same way. A soft gray sky blanketed the city. The streets still glistened with leftover rain from the night before, and the smell of coffee, always coffee, wafted from open kitchen windows. I lived in a neighborhood just quiet enough to make you feel safe, but not so quiet that you could forget your loneliness. My name's Ethan Miller. I'm 27. I work as a shift coordinator at a long-term care facility on the north side of the city, a red brick building filled with wheelchairs, fading family portraits, and slow conversations. It's not a job I dreamed of, but it's honest work, and in a world where honesty is rare, that counts for something. Each day, I woke up to the same routine: cold floor, cheap coffee, silence at breakfast. I still lived at home, or what passed for home. My parents' 2-story house in East Portland had once been warm. Now, it felt like a waiting room where everyone avoided eye contact. Dad Gerald was a man always chasing his next big idea. He tried flipping houses in the 90s, failed. Opened a smoothie shop in 2008, failed harder. Then came the app startup he couldn't explain, the cryptocurrency obsession, the backyard solar project. All of them ended in debt, denial, and and someone else's blame. Still, he walked like a man who believed the world owed him a second chance, and Mom Diane was precision wrapped in pearls. Nothing escaped her control. Not the thermostat, not the bank account, not the portion of spaghetti on your plate. She never yelled, never cursed, but somehow, her silence hurt more than any shout ever could. They had mastered the art of coexisting in the same space while living in different emotional worlds, like two statues positioned just close enough to seem intimate, but never touching. I grew up in that air, thick with tension, polite smiles, and unopened truths. I learned quickly how to disappear in plain sight, how to nod during dinner, how to breathe just quietly enough not to disturb the peace. The house itself matched the mood. Outdated wallpaper curled at the edges. The hallway light flickered when the microwave ran. The living room smelled like old pine wood and furniture polish. And the couch. God. That couch had a permanent sag in the middle, like it was tired of carrying the weight of our unspoken things. Still, I stayed. Part of it was guilt. Mom had convinced me that moving out meant abandoning family responsibility. Part of it was fear of what I'd find out there on my own. But most of it was numbness. I wasn't really living. I was enduring. At work, I kept my head down, signed off nurse schedules, checked medication lists, brought in birthday cards for the residents, and listened when they talked about sons who never visited. In those moments, I felt like someone who could witness pain without causing it. My coworkers were kind, in a distant way. They called me the quiet guy. I called it peace. On weekends, I walked 2 blocks to the corner cafe, ordered the same vanilla latte, read secondhand mystery novels that smelled like basement shelves, watched strangers laugh about things I couldn't imagine. I didn't date, didn't party, didn't try. Emotions were risky, and in this house, I'd learned that risk leads to regret. Sometimes, I think about leaving, pack a duffel bag, find a studio apartment. Start small, but the thought never made it past breakfast. There was always some excuse. Rent was too high. Timing wasn't right. Mom looked tired. Dad needed help with some idea. Or maybe I just wasn't brave enough to want something different. Then came the phone call. Dad had been on speaker with someone, voice low, conspiratorial. I wasn't paying attention until I heard the words, "Yeah, she can't live alone anymore. We'll bring her here." That night, over silent dinner and clinking forks, he announced it, smiling too wide, like he was trying out a new sales pitch. "Your grandma's moving in next week," he said casually, like he was discussing the weather. "She's not well, and it's the right thing to do." My fork froze midair. Grandma Eleanor from Sedona. I hadn't seen her since I was 10. My memory of her was soft lavender perfume, a voice like warm tea, hands always busy folding laundry. She'd always been gentle, always distant. Dad never visited her, and Mom always had reasons to stay home. And now, after all these years, she was coming here. Diane just smiled her signature smile, the one that looked warm if you didn't look too close. "It'll be good for her," she said. "Besides, we have space." I didn't say a word. But inside, something cracked. I didn't know what this was yet. A reunion, a burden, or something else entirely. All I knew was nothing in this house ever happened without a reason, and nothing was ever as simple as it sounded. The sky was spitting drizzle the morning she arrived. I stood on the porch with my hands stuffed into the pockets of a worn jacket, watching as the yellow cab crept to a stop at the curb. The engine sputtered before dying out completely. The driver climbed out first, then moved to open the passenger door. And there she was, Eleanor Grace. She stepped out slowly, clutching an old brown suitcase in one hand, the other gripping the door for balance. A gray wool coat hung loosely over her small frame, Her silver hair was pulled back neatly, and though her eyes were tired, they scanned the house with a quiet alertness that made my stomach twist. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, like time had been erasing her bit by bit. Dad was already at the front steps, arms wide, his voice overly bright. "Mom, look at you, still tough as nails, huh?" He pulled her into a hug that felt more like a performance. She didn't return it fully, just patted his back and offered a faint smile. I wasn't sure if it was from politeness or discomfort. Behind him, Mom hovered in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She wore that same pressed blouse she always did when she wanted to look composed. Her arms were crossed, lips curled into that polite curve, the one that never touched her eyes. I stepped forward, not knowing what to say. She looked at me, then really looked, and a flicker of recognition passed over her face. "Ethan," she said softly, "you've grown into a fine young man." Her voice was raspy but gentle. She reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was cool, but her grip was steady. "Hi, Grandma," I mumbled, managing a tight smile before I turned away to grab her suitcase. It was heavier than it looked, packed with objects I'd later learn were small pieces of a long, private life letters, photos, trinkets, a box made of cedar with something hidden inside. We guided her up the front steps and into the house. She moved slowly, eyes taking in every corner, every faded frame on the wall. Her presence shifted the energy of the place. It wasn't loud, but it was there. Something still, something honest. And that made everyone uncomfortable. Her room had once been a storage closet. We'd cleared it out the week before, threw in a twin bed, an old dresser, and a crooked lamp. The wall still had water stains from a leak years ago. The ceiling creaked when you walked overhead. But she didn't complain, just set down her suitcase, smoothed the bed with her palm, and began arranging her things in quiet dignity. A framed photo of her and Grandpa when they were young, a few books, a small jar of lavender, and the cedar box always placed beside her pillow. Dinner that night was awkward. Mom made a dry meatloaf, and Dad talked too much about traffic. Grandma just smiled and ate slowly. No one asked her about Sedona. No one mentioned Grandpa. She cooked breakfast the next morning, thick oatmeal with brown sugar and roasted apples. The smell alone made the kitchen feel warmer than it had in years. But when Mom walked in and saw it, her face pinched slightly. "Mom, we usually just grab cereal. You don't have to go through all this trouble." Grandma nodded, her voice calm. "I just like starting the day with something warm." She wasn't defiant, just certain. Later, I passed by the living room and saw her folding laundry with a kind of reverence, like every piece of cloth deserved care. Her movements were slow but deliberate. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was grounding like gravity in a house that had long been floating in dishonesty. And yet, I felt uneasy. She'd ask me questions at night when I brought her tea. "How's work? Do you still read those detective stories? Do you have someone special in your life?" Her tone was never intrusive, only curious. But the way she looked at me, it felt like she saw things I didn't know how to say. I didn't know how to answer her, maybe because I'd spent so long not answering anything to anyone. But the house was shifting, subtly, like a boat rocking ever so slightly before the storm. Dad started talking more about a new business idea, a coffee bar for young professionals. Mom began tidying the house like it was about to go on sale, and Eleanor sat by the window most evenings, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the street, like she was waiting for something, or maybe like she already knew what was coming. It started with whispers, half conversations behind closed doors, hushed tones that quieted when I entered the room, the clink of glasses, the rustle of paperwork, and then silence. The kind of silence that isn't peace, just the sound of something being buried. Dad had a new obsession, a cafe. Not just any cafe, of course. A hybrid experience space, as he called it. He described it with the same feverish energy he used to talk about his smoothie truck, his virtual coin business, his solar panel empire that never made it past a sketch on a napkin. This is it. Ethan, he told me one night, pacing the living room while I tried to focus on a rerun. Downtown Portland's evolving. People want cozy. They want curated. Think mismatched furniture. Edison bulbs. Vinyl records playing at brunch. He paused, waiting for me to nod. I didn't. What do you think he pushed? I shrugged. Sounds like every cafe that already exists. He frowned. That's the problem. Everyone's thinking small. I'm thinking legacy. Legacy. He said it like he'd earned one. A few days later, I noticed a manila folder on the kitchen counter. Half open, with papers peeking out. Deed evaluations, property estimates, notes scribbled in Dad's handwriting. Sedona House, potential seed fund. The pieces clicked, too easily. He wasn't just dreaming, he was scheming. Mom played her role as always quiet, composed, complicit. She brought up long-term care costs over dinner. Your grandmother isn't getting any younger, she said, stabbing her asparagus with robotic precision. It might be smart for her to move her assets. Just in case. Grandma said nothing, just chewed. Eyes focused somewhere far beyond the dining room walls. Later that night, I heard them again behind their bedroom door. She's old, Gerald. She won't need that house much longer. She's holding on to it for no reason. It's empty. It's wasted potential. Then convince her. The next morning, Eleanor made her famous herb biscuits. She moved slower than usual, her breath shorter. I offered to help, but she waved me off. I like working with my hands. It keeps the heart honest. I don't know why that sentence hit me the way it did, but it did. Later, she handed me a small plate with a warm biscuit and said, "Take this to the nurse at your job, the one with the soft voice. She reminds me of someone I once loved." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. At work that day, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I started noticing more details: how thin she was getting, how she flinched when Mom raised her voice just a little too high, how Dad stopped speaking to her directly unless it was about logistics. One evening, I came home to find Dad in the living room, gesturing wildly over a laptop. On the screen was a layout for the new cafe renderings, logo drafts, tables lined with fake plants and exposed brick. He noticed me and grinned. "Check it out. I got a designer from California working on the branding. All we need now is the capital. Just a little jump start." He said it so casually, like he was ordering takeout. I asked, "And where's that coming from?" He didn't answer. That night, Eleanor and I shared a cup of tea in the kitchen. I asked her carefully how she was feeling about everything. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "Your father used to draw on the walls when he was little. He'd scribble suns and boats and dreams in crayon. I never erased them, not because I thought they were good, but because I wanted him to believe they were." She sipped her tea. I thought that would help him grow. I think I made a mistake. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Then came the morning I found her alone at the dining table, signing papers. Her hands trembled slightly. Mom stood nearby, arms folded, watching like a notary. I froze. "Grandma," I said, stepping closer. She didn't look up, just slid the last page into a folder and whispered, "It's just the house. It's not who I am." I walked out before I could explode. That weekend, I overheard Mom on the phone. She was laughing, actually laughing. "Yes, the Sedona place is finally gone. We'll wire the money to Gerald's business account once it clears." The finality in her voice felt like ice down my spine. That night, Eleanor didn't come to dinner. I found her sitting on her bed, staring at the wooden box she always kept nearby. She opened it when she saw me. Inside were old letters, a faded photograph of my grandfather, and a ring tucked into a handkerchief. She didn't say a word, just closed the lid and placed it back beside her pillow. The next morning, the house felt different. Dad was humming. Mom made pancakes for the first time in years. The energy was lighter, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sacred had been sold, and no one even noticed. And Eleanor, she just folded laundry, like she always did, but her eyes had dimmed, like she'd let go of something she'd been holding for too long, something no one in this house would ever understand. It happened on a Tuesday. The rain had been falling all afternoon, steady and cold, soaking the sidewalks and dripping from every rooftop in the neighborhood. The kind of Portland rain that doesn't roar, just lingers quiet, stubborn, bone deep. I came home late from work, exhausted, damp, clutching a grocery bag with herbal tea and apples. Something to help Grandma sleep better. Something to feel like I was still trying. I opened the front door, and I knew something was wrong. The air was thick, not with smoke or food or candles, but with tension. The kind you can't see but feel like an invisible wire stretched too tight. I heard voices, low, sharp. I crept toward the living room, staying just out of sight. I could see the edge of the couch, the glow of the lamp, the outline of my father's shadow pacing. Mom, don't be ridiculous. That money is just sitting there. It's not like you're going on vacation. I told you already. Eleanor's voice fragile but resolute. That savings is for when I'm sick, or worse. It's not for a cafe. It's not for your next scheme. You're acting like I'm stealing it, Dad snapped. It's for the family. It's for your care. No, she said, her voice cracking. It's for my dignity. Mom's voice joined in sweet and venomous. Don't make this difficult. You're not thinking clearly. You're not young anymore. You don't need money. You need people who'll take care of you. There was a pause. Then Eleanor whispered, You don't take care of me. You use me. My chest clenched. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling. Hit record. What was I hoping for? Evidence, closure, justice? Maybe all of it. I watched through the doorway as my father's expression changed. Redness crept up his neck. His jaw clenched. He stepped forward and shouted louder than I'd ever heard in this house. Then get out. My heart stopped. You won't help us. You won't give us anything. You sit in that room like a queen while we scrape by. Mom didn't stop him. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, arms crossed, a slight shake of her head. A disapproving mother, not a daughter-in-law. Grandma didn't move right away. But then, she stood, slowly, carefully. Her hands shook as she reached for her wooden box. Her eyes met his. No tears, just something far heavier, disappointment. She didn't speak again. She walked past them, walked down the hallway. The suitcase was already packed. Had she known this would come? Had she always known? The door creaked open. I moved fast, slipped out the back door, heart racing. Rain smacked my face as I rounded the house. She was already at the sidewalk. Her coat was too thin. Her scarf was damp. Her suitcase wobbled as she pulled it along, wheels catching in the cracks of the pavement. She never looked back. I shouted, "Grandma!" She turned, startled, her face pale under the streetlight. "Ethan, go back inside. You'll catch cold." I shook my head, stepping forward, rain soaking through my shoes. "No, I'm not letting you walk away like this." She smiled faintly, sadness pulling at the corners of her mouth. "I'll be fine. I've always been fine." I grabbed the suitcase handle, gently pulled it from her grip. "You don't have to be anymore." We stood like that for a moment, just two people in the rain, a storm overhead, and something even heavier beneath it. A quiet, unspoken truth passed between us. She nodded. I called a cab. I didn't think I just gave the driver the address to the care facility where I worked. I knew it was warm. I knew the night staff would be there. And more than anything, I knew it was the only place where she would be safe. Inside the car, she shivered slightly. I took off my jacket, wrapped it around her shoulders. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. I looked at her. Yes, I did. The facility's front lights glowed amber, cutting through the fog. Linda, one of the night nurses, met us at the door, eyes wide with concern. "Ethan, what happened?" "This is my grandmother," I said, breathless. "She needs a room, just for tonight. Please." Linda didn't ask questions, just opened the door wider. We got her into a guest room, small but warm, with clean sheets and a single reading lamp. I helped her change into dry clothes from my overnight locker, made her ginger tea, tucked her in. She laid back, staring at the ceiling, her hand still clutching the old handkerchief I'd retrieved from the floor at home. I sat beside her, on the edge of the narrow bed. "I'll stay," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't answer. She just reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, for the first time in weeks, it felt like something had finally broken open. And not everything that breaks is a tragedy. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Portland's skies were still heavy, thick with mist. But the quiet was different now. Not the suffocating kind we lived with back at the house. This quiet felt clean, like the world had been rinsed of something poisonous overnight. Grandma was still asleep when I stepped out of the guest room. Her breathing was steady, soft. I stood there for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the white blanket, wondering how many nights she'd laid awake back home, pretending not to notice the way my parents looked at her like a burden. At the front desk, I found Linda sipping coffee, her eyes already asking questions. "She can stay," she said before I could even speak. "Mr. Thompson already approved it. Temporary placement for now, long-term if needed. We'll sort out billing later." I felt a wave of something I hadn't known I needed relief. "Thank you," I whispered. Linda just nodded and handed me a clipboard. "You did the right thing." "Ethan," I didn't know if that was true. I hadn't stood up when I should have. I hadn't said anything when she signed away her house. I hadn't yelled when they threw her out, but I had done something. And maybe that was enough to start over. I spent the rest of the morning sitting by Grandma's side. We didn't talk much. I read her a few pages from a novel she'd brought. She dozed off now and then. I just stayed close. When she finally looked at me again, her voice was thin, but warm. "This place is nice. It's safe," I said. She smiled. "That's more than most people get." That week, I found an apartment 2 blocks from the care center. Small, just a kitchen, a bed, and a window that overlooked a crooked streetlight, but it felt like mine. For the first time in years, I packed a bag and left my parents' house without telling them where I was going. I left behind the couch, the flickering hallway light, the closed-door arguments, the smell of guilt baked into the walls. I kept one thing, though the video on my phone, the moment Dad told her to get out, the look in her eyes, the sound of the rain swallowing her steps. I didn't post it. Not yet. But it was there, waiting. At the care home, Eleanor began to change. Not all at once, but slowly, like a room filling with light after you pull back the curtain. She joined the other residents for breakfast, started talking to Clara, a sharp-witted woman who never lost a game of dominoes. She laughed more, smiled longer, and some days, she even hummed as she sat by the window, hands busy knitting things no one asked for, but everyone appreciated. Her room was modest, but she made it hers. She brought in a quilt from Sedona, framed a photo of Grandpa, and lined the dresser with dried lavender. I came every evening after work. Sometimes we'd walk the garden path behind the building. Sometimes we just sat and shared tea in silence. But in that silence, I found something I hadn't had in years. Peace. One night, she handed me the wooden box she always kept near her bed. Inside were documents, legal papers, notarized signatures, loan records, and a letter. She watched me read it, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Your father forged my name on a property transfer 15 years ago," she said quietly. I let it go. I thought maybe he'd grow into something better. She looked down. I was wrong. I sat still, every nerve in my body on fire. "I didn't want to burden you with this," she said. "I didn't want you to have to choose between your parents and me." My throat tightened. "You don't have to choose," I said. "You already did. You chose to love him, even when he didn't deserve it." She didn't cry. Neither did I. But something passed between us in that moment. Truth, pain, maybe even freedom. That night, I took the papers to Mr. Carter, a lawyer connected through the care center. I showed him the documents, and then the video. He nodded. "You have something solid here. Ethan, it'll take time, but there's a case." We started the process. I didn't tell Grandma. She'd already given enough. She just wanted rest, dignity, a place where no one called her dead weight. I could give her that, and I would. She passed away on a quiet Thursday night. There was no thunder, no storm, just the faint hum of the city in the distance, the wind pressing gently against the windows, and the soft click of her lamp still glowing in the corner of her room. Catherine, one of the night nurses, someone I'd grown close to in the past few months, was the one who called me. "Ethan," she said, her voice low, "careful. You should come now. Ruth stopped breathing about 20 minutes ago." I didn't speak, just nodded through the phone and drove. The road unfamiliar, even though I knew every turn. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight I couldn't feel my fingers. My heart felt like it had sunk somewhere behind my ribs. When I walked into the room, she looked peaceful. Her lips curled slightly, like she was still mid-conversation with a memory. The embroidered handkerchief was folded neatly on her chest. Her cedar box sat on the nightstand, unopened, untouched. I sat beside her and reached for her hand. Cold now, but I held it anyway. I cried. Not with sobs or noise, but the kind of cry that comes from somewhere deeper than the throat, like grief curling inward. I cried for the years I wasn't there, for the meals she ate alone, for the silence I let stretch too long between us, and for the fact that, somehow, she still forgave me. She left me everything, not because I asked, not because I deserved it, but because that's who she was. I buried her in Sedona, Arizona, just as she had wished. The same hill where my grandfather was laid to rest decades ago. The air was drier there, sweeter somehow. The earth smelled like sage and old stories. I didn't tell my parents. They didn't deserve to be there. I stood alone at her grave, the stones still bare, the soil freshly turned, and whispered, "You're home now." Beside me, Catherine held my hand. We had grown close, slowly shared smiles over patient charts, quiet jokes during night shifts, late coffees before sunrise. She was the first person who didn't ask me to explain my silence. She just sat with it. Later that afternoon, we sat beneath a twisted juniper tree near the cemetery. The sun dipped behind red stone cliffs, and wind moved softly across the grass. "I've never seen someone fight so quietly," Catherine said. She didn't need noise. I answered. She just needed someone to believe her. I handed Catherine the small cedar box Eleanor had left behind. Inside was her wedding ring. Silver, worn smooth, still warm from memory. She wanted me to give this to someone I loved, I said, my voice breaking. Catherine looked at me, eyes wide, mouth softening into something between awe and ache. I didn't ask her to marry me that day, but I knew I would. Back in Portland, life moved slowly forward. I didn't return to my parents' house, didn't answer their calls. The The day after Grandma passed, I got a voicemail from my mother. She's gone. Well, maybe it's better that way. She was suffering. Then my father's voice in the background. Loud, dismissive. She brought it on herself. I deleted the message. Their words didn't sting anymore. They only confirmed what I already knew. Mr. Carter filed the lawsuit 2 weeks later. Forged documents. Fraud. Elder financial abuse. We had the evidence, the video, the bank transfers. My parents didn't show up to the first court date, but word got out. In a city like Portland, word always gets out, within days. The video went viral, a quiet storm of online outrage. People shared it not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, raw, familiar. Too many people had seen something like it and said nothing. I didn't post it out of revenge. I posted it because the silence had gone on long enough. At the care center, the staff treated me differently. Not with pity, but with a strange kind of reverence, like I'd done something brave. But it wasn't bravery. It was grief, sharpened into action. Catherine and I moved in together the following spring. A small apartment near the park. A little balcony where we planted lavender in Eleanor's honor. Some nights we sat out there with mugs of tea, and she'd lean her head on my shoulder. You're quieter when you're happy, she once said. Or maybe I'm just finally at peace. The lawsuit moved forward, slowly. Dad's business collapsed under scrutiny. Creditors came knocking. My mother tried to make a public apology. I didn't respond. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closing a door and choosing not to open it again. Then, 1 year after Eleanor's funeral, something new happened. We had a son. We named him Simon after my grandfather. He had Eleanor's eyes, honest, warm, and quietly searching. One afternoon, Catherine and I took Simon back to Sedona. We sat on the same hill beneath the juniper tree. I placed daisies on the grave, her favorite flower. Catherine held Simon, rocking him gently, while the sun cast golden lines across the horizon. I spoke aloud, not expecting anyone to answer. Grandma, we're okay. We're whole, and I promise I'll raise him the way you would have wanted. The wind moved through the grass, and just for a moment, it carried the faintest scent of lavender. There are some stories that don't end. They echo long after the door has closed. Long after the people are gone. They stay with you, etched into the way you speak, the way you love, the way you stand up, even when your knees shake. Eleanor Grace wasn't just my grandmother. She was my reminder that kindness, when unprotected, becomes a target. That silence, when stretched too long, becomes complicity. And that love, real love, is something you have to fight for gently, but fiercely. I used to believe that family meant loyalty, that blood came first, no matter what, but she taught me otherwise. She taught me that family isn't who shares your name, it's who shares your burdens. It's who stands between you and the storm, not the ones who push you out into it. She taught me that dignity isn't something you earn with age, it's something you defend with grace. And that the smallest acts, a folded scarf, a bowl of warm porridge, a hand held quietly in the dark, are sometimes the most heroic. When I look at Simon now, tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I think of all the things I want him to know. To be kind, yes, but not to let kindness make him a doormat. To be soft, but not spineless. To speak gently, but never be afraid to say, no. I want him to know that doing the right thing won't always feel good. That love sometimes means walking away from people who were supposed to protect you, because protecting yourself matters too. And I want him to know that he comes from a line of strong, quiet hearts. He'll never meet Eleanor, but he'll live in the house she built with her patience, her pain, her refusal to give up on me even when I gave up on myself. I still visit her grave every year, still plant daisies, still close my eyes when the wind shifts and pretend that's somewhere. She hears me. I tell her everything, And I always end the same way. I'm living well, Grandma, just like you wanted. And I'm not afraid anymore. Not of the silence, not of the past, not of becoming you. Because now I know that's the best thing I could ever be.